The grand villa stood on the outskirts of the bustling city, its luxurious halls and expansive gardens symbolizing wealth and status. Inside, Aaliyah lived a life that, to the world, seemed perfect. At 32, she was married to Saima, a wealthy businessman whose empire stretched across several industries. But beneath the glossy surface of her life lay a suffocating void. Saima's absence was constant, his affection distant, and his attention fleeting. He considered their marriage a partnership of convenience, something to be maintained for appearances. For Aaliyah, it felt like a gilded cage. One afternoon, a knock at the kitchen door interrupted Aaliyah's thoughts. It was Mira, their housekeeper, accompanied by a young man carrying a small bag. Mira introduced him as Armaan, the new servant hired to assist with the household chores. Armaan was in his mid-20s, with an earnest demeanor and a shy smile. His presence was quiet and respectful, his gaze never lingering longer than necessary. Aaliyah noted his modesty and the way he immediately began helping Mira with the tasks without hesitation. Over the following days, Armaan seamlessly blended into the household routine. Aaliyah often found herself observing him from afar, intrigued by his calmness. He was diligent and careful, never overstepping boundaries but always attentive. Once, as she struggled to carry a stack of books to the library, Armaan appeared silently by her side, taking the weight off her hands without a word. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than intended. "It's my duty, madam," he replied, bowing slightly before walking away. That interaction replayed in Aaliyah's mind later that evening as she sat alone in the vast dining hall. The table was set for two, as it always was, but Saima had called to say he wouldn't be home until late. He didn't even bother making excuses anymore. For the first time in years, Aaliyah felt curious about someone. Who was Armaan? What was his story? How had he ended up here? The next morning, as she sipped tea on the balcony, she spotted him tending to the garden. She couldn't help but notice how comfortable he looked among the flowers, his hands moving with care and precision. Later, she found herself near the garden, pretending to admire the blooms. Armaan noticed her presence and straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "These roses are beautiful," she said, breaking the silence. "They are, madam. With the right care, they bloom even in harsh weather." Something in his words resonated deeply with her. Care. It was such a simple concept, yet it had been absent from her life for so long. Aaliyah returned to the house, feeling a strange warmth she hadn't felt in years. As the weeks passed, their interactions became more frequent. Armaan's genuine kindness and quiet confidence began to fill the empty spaces in Aaliyah's days. She found excuses to linger where he worked, whether in the kitchen or the garden. At first, it was small conversations about mundane topics, but soon they started sharing stories. One afternoon, Aaliyah asked, "Do you have a family, Armaan?" His expression softened. "My parents passed away when I was a child. My uncle raised me, but when he fell ill, I started working to support myself." Aaliyah nodded, touched by his resilience. "That must have been hard." It was. But sometimes, life doesn't give you choices. You just do what you must to keep going. His words lingered with her long after the conversation ended. Aaliyah had been given everything material in life, but she realized how little of it brought her happiness. Saima's indifference and the superficial social circles she inhabited felt meaningless compared to the simple authenticity Armaan carried. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Aaliyah stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Armaan's voice drifted in from the hallway, soft but melodic, as he hummed an old folk tune while cleaning. She closed her eyes, allowing the sound to wash over her. It was a small moment, but it stirred something inside her, a longing she hadn't acknowledged before. The distance between them was vast, defined by status, expectations, and societal norms. Yet, Aaliyah couldn't deny that Armaan's presence brought a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Her days no longer felt monotonous, and her evenings weren't as unbearably lonely. But with that realization came a quiet fear. What was she feeling? And where could it possibly lead? The days began to take on a new rhythm for Aaliyah. What once were long stretches of time spent alone in the cavernous house now had moments she quietly looked forward to. Armaan's presence was steady, like the background hum of rain, soothing, yet undeniable. Seima's absences were more frequent than ever. He'd often send terse text messages informing Aaliyah of his late-night meetings or sudden business trips. Not that she cared. In his absence, the house felt lighter, freer. She and Armaan crossed paths more often, and with each interaction, the distance between them seemed to shrink. One rainy afternoon, Aaliyah was reading in the library when the power suddenly went out, plunging the house into darkness. She heard hurried footsteps approaching. "Madam," Armaan's voice came from the doorway, calm but concerned. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she replied, though her heart was racing from the sudden loss of light. "I just wasn't expecting this. Let me fetch some candles for you." Before she could respond, he disappeared and returned moments later, placing 2 flickering candles on the table beside her. His face, illuminated by the soft glow, looked different in this light, warmer, more vulnerable. "Thank you, Armaan," she said softly. He hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's nothing, madam. Let me know if you need anything else." As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Armaan, do you ever feel lonely?" He froze in place, clearly taken aback by the question. After a pause, he turned back to face her. "I do, madam. But I've learned to live with it. Loneliness doesn't go away, you just make space for it." Aaliyah felt a lump in her throat. She recognized her own feelings in his words. The house grew silent again, except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their shared silence saying more than words ever could. The next day, as the rain continued, Aaliyah invited Armaan to join her for tea on the veranda. It was the first time she'd broken the unspoken rules of hierarchy between them, and she could see the hesitation in his eyes. "Madam, please, Armaan. Just sit. It's only tea." He obeyed, though he looked uncomfortable as he took the seat across from her. She handed him a cup, and they sat quietly, watching the raindrops dance on the garden leaves. "Do you miss your family?" Aaliyah asked after a while. Armaan took a sip before replying, "Sometimes. I think about what life might have been like if things had been different. But wishing for what isn't doesn't help. So, I focus on what is." "You sound wiser than most people I know," Aaliyah said with a faint smile. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And you, madam? What do you wish for?" The question caught her off guard. She wasn't used to being asked what she wanted. No one had ever cared enough to ask. She looked down at her cup, avoiding his gaze. "I don't know," she murmured. "Sometimes, I think I've forgotten how to wish for anything." Armaan didn't respond, but she felt his eyes on her, filled with an empathy that made her chest tighten. Over the following weeks, their bond deepened. Aaliyah began seeking Armaan's company more openly, though always under the guise of harmless conversation. He had a quiet wisdom that calmed her restless mind, and his stories of growing up in a small village fascinated her. She admired his resilience, his ability to find contentment despite having so little. One evening, she found herself in the kitchen, watching Armaan as he prepared dinner. The sight of him moving so effortlessly, his hands skilled and precise, made her heart ache in a way she couldn't explain. "Armaan," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "do you ever dream of leaving this life behind? Starting over somewhere else?" He looked up from the cutting board, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't know, madam. Sometimes I dream, but dreams don't pay bills." Aaliyah laughed softly, though the sadness in his words lingered. "If you could do anything, what would it be?" He thought for a moment before replying, "I'd like to open a small cafe. Somewhere quiet, where people can come to rest and talk. I've always loved cooking, and I think I'd be happy doing that." She smiled, picturing it. "I think you'd be good at that." Their conversation was interrupted by Mira entering the kitchen, and Aaliyah quickly excused herself, retreating to her bedroom. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Armaan's dreams and the growing yearning in her own heart to be part of them. As their connection deepened, so did her internal conflict. She knew society would condemn even the slightest impropriety between them. She knew Seima's wrath would be unforgiving if he suspected anything. But for the first time in years, Aaliyah felt alive. One day, she found herself standing near Armaan as he cleaned the patio. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm. He froze, startled by her gesture. "Aaliyah," he whispered, her name slipping out before he could stop himself. It was the first time he had ever addressed her without the formal madam, and the sound of it sent a shiver down her spine. For a long moment, they stood there, the space between them electric. Then, as if realizing the weight of what had just happened, Armaan stepped back. "Forgive me," he said, his voice barely audible. He turned and walked away, leaving Aaliyah standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew then that she couldn't keep pretending. Something was happening between them, something neither of them could ignore. But where it would lead, she couldn't yet say. Aaliyah paced the length of her bedroom that evening, her thoughts swirling uncontrollably. Her feelings for Armaan had grown far beyond anything she'd ever anticipated. She couldn't deny it any longer. What had begun as mere admiration had blossomed into something deeper. But the reality of their circumstances loomed over her like a shadow, making every stolen glance and accidental touch feel both thrilling and terrifying. The following morning, she found herself drawn to the garden, where she knew Armaan would be tending to the plants. She spotted him near the rose bushes, his hands carefully trimming the leaves. The sunlight danced on his face, highlighting the focus in his eyes. For a moment, she just watched him, unsure of how to approach the storm building within her. "Armaan," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. He straightened, turning to face her. "Madam, can we talk?" His expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his features. Still, he nodded, setting his tools aside. She motioned for him to follow her to the shaded bench under a large oak tree. They sat in silence for a moment, the distance between them palpable. "I don't know how to say this," Aaliyah began, clasping her hands together tightly. "But I need to tell you the truth. Madam, if I've done anything to—" "No," she interrupted, shaking her head. "You've done nothing wrong, Armaan. This is about how I feel." His eyes widened slightly, but he didn't speak, waiting for her to continue. "You've brought something into my life that I didn't realize I was missing. Kindness. Peace. A sense of being seen." Her voice faltered, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I think about you all the time, Armaan. And I know it's wrong. I know we live in a world where this can't happen, but I can't pretend anymore." The weight of her confession hung in the air. Aaliyah felt her heart hammering in her chest, the silence almost unbearable. "Madam," Armaan said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I don't know what to say. I never wanted to cause you any pain or confusion." "You haven't," she assured him quickly. "You've done nothing but show me what it feels like to be cared for." He exhaled slowly, his shoulders heavy with the burden of their unspoken connection. "I would be lying if I said I didn't feel something for you too. But this," he gestured between them. "This isn't simple. You have a husband. A life. And I'm just—" "Don't," she interrupted, her tone firm. "Don't diminish yourself like that. You're more than just anything, Armaan." The honesty in her voice made his resolve waver, but he quickly composed himself. "Aaliyah," he said, her name slipping from his lips like a secret, "what we feel may be real, but it's dangerous. For you, for me. If anyone were to find out—" "I don't care," she said desperately. "For the first time in years, I feel alive. I feel seen. Isn't that worth something?" Armaan looked at her, torn between his growing affection and the harsh reality of their situation. Before he could respond, the distant sound of a car pulling up the driveway made them both freeze. Saima had returned. That evening, the tension in the house was almost suffocating. Saima's presence felt heavier than usual, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. During dinner, he barely acknowledged Aaliyah, instead scrolling through his phone and barking instructions to his assistants over the speaker. Aaliyah sat in silence, her appetite non-existent. After the meal, she retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. She pressed her palms against her temples, the weight of her emotions threatening to consume her. Saima's indifference had never felt more glaring, more painful, in contrast to Armaan's quiet tenderness. Days passed, and Saima left again on another business trip, leaving Aaliyah and Armaan alone in the house. Their conversations grew more guarded, but the emotions between them were undeniable. One evening, unable to hold back her feelings any longer, Aaliyah sought Armaan out in the kitchen. He looked up as she entered, his expression cautious. "Madam." "Aaliyah," she corrected him firmly. "Please, just call me Aaliyah." He hesitated before nodding. "Aaliyah." She stepped closer, her pulse quickening. "I know you're afraid. So am I. But I can't keep pretending this doesn't exist. Tell me honestly, do you want this as much as I do?" His breath caught, and for a moment, he couldn't look at her. But then he did, his eyes filled with vulnerability and longing. "Yes," he whispered. "I do. But wanting it doesn't make it right." "I don't care about right or wrong anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "All I know is that when I'm with you, I feel free. I feel like myself again." Armaan's resolve crumbled. Without thinking, he closed the distance between them, his hand brushing against hers. The electricity in that simple touch was overwhelming. Slowly, he leaned closer, his hesitation evident. "Aaliyah," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "this can't." But she silenced him, closing the gap and pressing her lips to his. The world seemed to stop in that moment, everything else fading away. When they finally pulled apart, the weight of what had just happened settled over them. They stood there in silence, the reality of their actions sinking in. I should go," Armaan said, stepping back. "Please don't," Aaliyah pleaded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. He hesitated, torn between his feelings and his fear. "We can't let this go any further. It's not just about us. There are consequences." Aaliyah nodded, though her heart ached. "I understand. But that doesn't make this any easier." As Armaan left the room, Aaliyah sank into a chair, her emotions a chaotic mix of joy and despair. She knew their actions would have repercussions, but she also knew she couldn't stop what had already begun. The house grew quieter after that night, yet the silence between Aaliyah and Armaan was laden with unspoken truths. Their interactions became more subtle, their words careful, but the depth of their connection only grew stronger. Every accidental touch, every fleeting glance was a reminder of the passion simmering beneath the surface. Aaliyah knew she should stop. She should respect the societal and moral boundaries that existed between them. But the more she tried to convince herself, the more she was drawn to Armaan. He was everything Sama wasn't: gentle, attentive, and kind. In him, she saw a mirror of her own longing for freedom, for connection, for something real. One evening, as the last traces of sunlight vanished from the sky, Aaliyah stood on the balcony overlooking the garden. Armaan was there, his hands busy arranging pots, his presence grounding as ever. On an impulse, she descended the stairs and made her way outside, her heart pounding with every step. "Armaan," she called softly, her voice carrying in the stillness. He turned, the faint light casting shadows on his face. "Aaliyah," he said hesitantly. He no longer addressed her as madam, though he still struggled with the intimacy of her name. She stepped closer, her pulse quickening. "I can't keep living like this. Pretending I'm fine. Pretending I don't feel anything." He shook his head, his conflict visible in his furrowed brow. "You don't understand what you're risking. Your life, your reputation, everything. And what about my happiness, Armaan? Does that not matter?" The raw emotion in her voice broke something in him. Closing the distance between them, he reached out, his fingers grazing hers. "Your happiness matters more than anything," he whispered. For a moment, they stood in the soft glow of the moonlight, the world fading around them. And then, as if drawn by an unseen force, their lips met in a kiss that spoke of all the longing, fear, and passion they had been holding back. That night, the lines they had carefully tried not to cross disappeared completely. Behind the closed doors of Aaliyah's room, they shared whispered confessions and tender caresses, their love finally given the space to breathe. For a few hours, they forgot the world outside, lost in the solace they found in each other. The following morning brought a sobering reality. Aaliyah woke early, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on her chest. Armaan sat by the window, his expression pensive as he stared at the garden below. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice still hushed. "That we can't keep this a secret forever," he replied without turning to face her. And when it comes out, the consequences won't be small. She moved to sit beside him, her hand covering his. I don't care about what people think. I care about us. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of love and worry. Aaliyah, I want to believe that. But this isn't just about society. Saima will find out eventually. And when he does. His words trailed off, but the implication was clear. Saima was a powerful man, and his reaction to discovering his wife's betrayal could be devastating not just for Aaliyah but for Armaan as well. Later that day, Aaliyah tried to go about her routine, but the tension was inescapable. Every glance from the other servants felt loaded with suspicion, though she knew most of it was in her head. When Mira entered the kitchen while she and Armaan were speaking, the older woman's curious eyes lingered a little too long. Aaliyah felt her heart race, paranoia creeping in. Be careful, Armaan whispered later, his concern evident. We can't afford to let anyone see us like this. I'll be cautious, she promised. But the passion they shared made discretion increasingly difficult. As days turned into weeks, Saima began noticing subtle changes in Aaliyah. She seemed distant yet happier, her melancholy replaced by a quiet glow. At first, he dismissed it, too absorbed in his work to care. But as the differences became more pronounced, he started to grow suspicious. One evening, while dining together, he asked, You've been different lately. Is there something going on I should know about? Aaliyah forced a smile, her stomach twisting in knots. Nothing at all, Saima. Maybe I've just been focusing on myself more. He didn't look convinced, his sharp eyes studying her. Well, whatever it is, keep it up. You actually look happy for once. His words, meant to sound like a compliment, felt more like an insult. Saima had never cared enough to notice her unhappiness before. Why did he care now? The pressure mounted one fateful afternoon when one of the servants accidentally overheard a conversation between Aaliyah and Armaan. Though the exchange was innocuous, the way Aaliyah spoke to him, gentle, almost tender, raised eyebrows. Whispers began to spread among the staff, and it was only a matter of time before those whispers reached Saima. That night, Armaan approached Aaliyah with a heavy heart. I think I need to leave, he said abruptly. Her heart dropped. Leave? What are you talking about? The servants are talking. Someone will say something to Saima. If I'm here when that happens, he paused, struggling to find the right words. I can't let this destroy you. Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. I don't care what they say. I won't lose you, Armaan. Please don't go. But he was resolute. It's not just about you, Aaliyah. If Saima finds out, he could ruin me too. My life, my dreams, everything. Aaliyah clutched his hand desperately. Then we'll leave. Together. I'll walk away from this life, from Saima, from everything. We can start over, somewhere far away. His expression softened, the depth of her love touching him profoundly. But before he could respond, the sound of a car engine roaring up the driveway broke the moment. Saima was home early. Both of them froze, the reality of their situation crashing down around them. Saima entered the house, his footsteps echoing in the marble-clad corridors. The tension in the air was palpable. Aaliyah stood frozen, her mind racing as Armaan retreated into the shadows of the kitchen. Aaliyah. Saima's voice called from the living room, sharp and impatient. Summoning her composure, she stepped out to meet him, her heart pounding. You're home early, she said, her tone carefully neutral. He gave her a scrutinizing look, his sharp eyes narrowing. Is that a problem? Of course not, she replied quickly. I just wasn't expecting you. Saima's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he sank into the leather armchair. I need a drink, he muttered. Where's that new servant of yours? Armaan, isn't it? Her breath hitched. He's probably in the kitchen. I'll get it for you. Don't bother, Saima said, waving her off. I want to see him myself. Before she could protest, Saima was already on his feet, heading toward the kitchen. Panic flared in Aaliyah's chest as she rushed after him, her mind scrambling for a way to defuse the situation. In the kitchen, Armaan was pretending to wipe the counters, though the tension in his posture was unmistakable. When Seymour entered, his commanding presence seemed to fill the room. "Armaan," he barked, his tone curt. "Yes, sir?" Armaan responded, keeping his gaze down. "Bring me a whiskey. Neat. And be quick about it." Armaan nodded, his movements steady but cautious as he prepared the drink. Aaliyah stood in the doorway, her hands clenched into fists. She could feel Seymour's suspicious gaze darting between them, though he said nothing. When Armaan handed him the glass, Seymour's fingers brushed against his accidentally, and he frowned as if irritated by the interaction. He turned to leave but stopped abruptly in the doorway. "You two seem close," he said, his tone laced with something dark. Aaliyah's heart sank. "He's a good worker, Seymour. That's all." Seymour said nothing more but walked away, leaving behind a suffocating silence. That night, Aaliyah couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed every moment of the day, her fear for Armaan's safety growing with each passing minute. Unable to bear it any longer, she crept downstairs and found him sitting in the servant quarters, his head in his hands. "Armaan," she whispered, stepping inside. He looked up, his exhaustion evident. "Aaliyah, you shouldn't be here." "I don't care," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "I can't let him do anything to you. We need to leave, now." His expression softened, but he shook his head. "It's not that simple. We can't just run away without a plan. We'll figure it out," she insisted. "I have money. Enough to get us far away from here. Please, Armaan." He hesitated, torn between his fear of the consequences and his overwhelming love for her. Finally, he nodded. "All right. But we need to be smart about this." The following morning, Aaliyah began putting their plan into action. While Seymour was out, she packed a small bag of essentials and withdrew a significant amount of cash from her personal account. She knew they couldn't stay in the city, Seymour's influence would reach them anywhere nearby. That evening, as the house grew quiet, Aaliyah and Armaan prepared to leave. She felt a pang of guilt as she walked through the halls one last time, but the thought of a life of freedom, of love, propelled her forward. "Are you ready?" Armaan asked as they stood by the back in trance, their bags in hand. She nodded. "I'm ready." But before they could step outside, the front door slammed open. Seymour stood in the entryway, his face twisted with fury. Behind him were two burly men, his guards. "So this is what you've been up to," Seymour spat, his voice dripping with venom. Aaliyah stepped in front of Armaan, her chin held high. "Seymour, don't do this." "Don't do what?" he barked. "Punish you for making a fool out of me? For sneaking around with a servant behind my back?" Armaan stepped forward. "This is my fault, sir. Don't blame her." Shut up," Seymour roared, his fist slamming into the wall. "You don't get to speak." "Seymour, stop this," Aaliyah pleaded, her voice breaking. "We're leaving. You can't stop us." He let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, you think it's that easy? You think I'll let you walk away from me, from everything I've built for you?" Aaliyah's voice grew firmer. "You never built anything for me. You've treated me like an accessory, not a wife. And now, I'm choosing my own happiness." For a moment, Seymour seemed taken aback by her defiance. Then, his rage returned, and he motioned to his guards. "Take him away. I'll deal with him myself." "No," Aaliyah screamed, throwing herself in front of Armaan. "Don't touch him." Seymour hesitated, clearly not expecting such a display. His guards paused, waiting for his orders. Armaan gently pulled Aaliyah aside, his gaze steady. "It's okay," he said softly. "You'll be okay." "No," she sobbed, clutching his arm. "We promised each other. We're in this together." Seeing the raw emotion between them, Seymour's resolve seemed to falter. He waved his guards away, his face contorted with anger and something that almost resembled regret. "You're both dead to me," he hissed. "Get out of my sight before I change my mind." Armaan and Aaliyah didn't wait. They grabbed their bags and left the house, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and relief. In the months that followed, they built a new life far away from the city. Armaan opened his cafe, just as he'd always dreamed, and Aaliyah found peace in his love and in the freedom she had so long craved. Their path wasn't easy, but it was theirs, and that was enough. In each other. They found what they had been missing all along, a love that didn't need permission or validation, only the courage to exist.